The Ghost Bus of Route 375, a Chinese supernatural tale. In the sprawling urban landscape of China, where ancient traditions often collide with modern life, there exists a story so chilling that it has become legendary among the late-night travelers of Beijing. This is the tale of Bus Route 375, a seemingly ordinary late-night service that connected Yuanming Yuan to Pregnant Hills, a mere 16-kilometer journey that should have been nothing more than a routine drive through the city's quieter districts. But on the night of November 14, 1995, that simple route became the setting for one of China's most haunting and inexplicable supernatural encounters. The digital clock at the Yuanming Yuan bus terminal clicked over to 1:45 a.m. as driver Liu Chen performed his usual pre-departure checks on Bus 375. At 45 years old, Liu had been driving this route for over a decade, and the late-night shift had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. His conductor, Wang Wei, a man in his early 30s, sat in his usual spot near the front, reviewing the night's ticket stubs with mechanical precision. The weather that night was unusually dense with fog, the kind of thick, soupy moisture that seemed to swallow light whole. It hung in the air like a funeral shroud, transforming familiar streets into mysterious passages through an otherworldly realm. The bus's headlights struggled to penetrate more than a few meters ahead, their beams creating an eerie halo in the misty darkness. As the last scheduled bus of the night, Route 375 typically carried a handful of late-shift workers, occasional partygoers, and the odd tourist who had lost track of time around the Summer Palace area. This night would prove to be different in ways that would haunt the memories of those fortunate enough to survive it. The bus made its first stop at the Summer Palace station just after 2 a.m. Through the fog emerged four figures: a middle-aged couple dressed in business attire, an elderly woman clutching a worn leather handbag, and a young man who appeared to be in his early 20s, wearing a university jacket and carrying a backpack. The couple, Mr. and Mrs. Zhang, as they would later be identified, took seats directly behind the driver. They spoke in hushed tones about their dinner with clients that had run later than expected. The elderly woman, who would later introduce herself as Madam Lin, settled into a seat midway down the bus, while the young student, Chen Wei, sat across from her. The interior of the bus was illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that cast strange shadows on the windows, creating mirror-like surfaces that reflected the passengers' faces against the darkness outside. The effect was unsettling, making it seem as though ghost versions of themselves were traveling alongside the bus in the night. As the bus continued its journey, the fog grew even thicker. Driver Liu, with decades of experience behind the wheel, found himself straining to see even the immediate road ahead. The usual landmarks that guided his route had vanished into the white void, and an increasing sense of unease began to creep into his consciousness. "Perhaps we should consider taking the alternate route through the main road," Liu suggested, his voice carrying a note of concern. "The visibility on our usual path is dangerous tonight." The conductor, Wang, nodded in agreement. "The fog is the worst I've seen in years. The main road would be safer, even if it takes a few minutes longer." From their seat behind the driver, Mr. Zhang spoke up firmly. "No, please stay on the regular route. We're already late, and our stop is just around the next turn. The regular path will only take a few more minutes." Madam Lin and Chen Wei exchanged glances, but remained silent. There was something in the air that night, a heaviness that seemed to press against their chests, making even breathing feel like a conscious effort. Against his better judgment, driver Liu continued along the regular route. The Zhangs disembarked at their stop, disappearing into the fog like ghosts melting into the ether. Their departure left an odd silence in the bus, broken only by the low rumble of the engine and the occasional squeak of the wipers fighting against the moisture in the air. It was precisely 2:30 a.m. when the bus came to a sudden halt. Through the fog, three figures had appeared in the middle of the road, their hands raised in the traditional gesture for stopping a bus. The headlights illuminated them in a way that made them appear almost translucent, like figures in an old photograph that had begun to fade. "What are they doing out here at this hour?" Chen Wei muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The bus stop was at least a kilometer behind them, and there were no houses or businesses nearby, only the dark shapes of trees and abandoned buildings that lined this stretch of road. The three figures boarded the bus, and immediately the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. They wore clothing that appeared to be from another era entirely, traditional Chinese garments that might have been appropriate during the Qing dynasty, but now looked grotesquely out of place on a modern bus. The clothes were caked with mud and what appeared to be other dark stains, giving off a musty odor that filled the enclosed space. Two of the figures supported a third between them, whose head hung low, long black hair obscuring their face entirely. They moved with an unnatural synchronization, as if they were one entity rather than three separate beings. None of them spoke as they paid their fares or as they took their seats near the back of the bus. Madame Lin felt it first, a deep, primal fear that started in her gut and spread through her body like ice water in her veins. Something was terribly wrong with these new passengers. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, kept returning to their feet, or rather, where their feet should have been. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the bus, she could see that their traditional robes seemed to end in nothingness, hovering just above the floor. The conductor, Wang, attempted to maintain an air of normalcy, suggesting to the visibly disturbed Madame Lin that the strange passengers must be actors from a local theater troupe. But his words rang hollow in the oppressive silence that had descended upon the bus. As they approached Pregnant Hills, a black cat darted across the road, its eyes reflecting the bus's headlights like golden coins in the darkness. Driver Liu, already on edge, slammed on the brakes, causing everyone to lurch forward. In that moment, a gust of wind from one of the bus's ventilation ducts blew through the cabin, lifting the hair from the face of the middle figure for just a split second. Madame Lin had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, nothing but an empty canvas of flesh. Understanding that their lives were in immediate danger, Madame Lin made a split-second decision. She stood up abruptly, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "My purse! It's gone! You!" She pointed an accusing finger at Chen Wei. "You stole it when we jerked forward." The young man's face registered shock and confusion. "What? No, I didn't." Madame Lin continued her performance, becoming increasingly hysterical. "I saw you! When the bus stopped, you reached over and took it! Driver, conductor, stop this bus immediately! We need to report this to the police!" The conductor, wanting to maintain order, suggested they exit the bus and resolve the issue at a nearby police station. As they stepped out into the fog, Madame Lin grabbed Chen Wei's arm with surprising strength and pulled him away from the bus. Only when they were a safe distance away did she release him and explain her actions. "Those weren't people," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The one in the middle had no face at all, and none of them had feet. They're not from our world, and if we had stayed on that bus..." She left the sentence unfinished, but Chen Wei understood. Concerned for the remaining passengers, they immediately reported the incident to the local police station. But as is often the case with supernatural encounters, their story was met with skepticism and dismissal. It wasn't until the next day, when bus 375 failed to reach its depot, that authorities began to take the matter seriously. The police investigation revealed something bizarre. CCTV cameras had tracked the bus normally until the point where Madame Lin and Chen Wei disembarked. After that, the vehicle seemed to vanish into thin air. None of the cameras along the route captured any sign of the bus, despite the fact that it should have passed by at least a dozen of them. 2 days later, a group of fishermen made a gruesome discovery. Bus 375 was found submerged in a river, an impossible 100 kilometers away from its route. The location made no sense. There were no roads leading to that area, and the terrain between the bus's last known location and the river was impassable for such a vehicle. When the bus was pulled from the water, the horror of that night became clear. Inside were 3 bodies: driver Liu, conductor Wang, and a third man who matched the description of the figure that had been supported by the 2 mysterious passengers. Despite having been dead for only 2 days, the bodies were in an advanced state of decomposition, as if they had been in the water for months. The fuel tank contained no diesel, only traces of what forensic analysis would later confirm to be human blood. The bus's internal camera had been activated during the journey, but when investigators reviewed the footage, they found only static and distorted images that seemed to show impossible angles of the bus's interior. Years have passed since that foggy November night, But the case of Bus 375 remains one of China's most puzzling supernatural incidents. No explanation has ever been found for how the bus traveled such a distance without fuel, why the bodies decomposed so rapidly, or who, or what the mysterious passengers really were. Madam Lin and Chen Wei's testimonies remain the only witness accounts of what transpired that night. Both have since refused to travel after dark, and neither has ever taken another late-night bus. Madam Lin, when interviewed years later, maintained that her quick thinking and understanding of the supernatural had saved their lives. Local legends have grown around the incident. Some say that on foggy nights, particularly around the anniversary of that fateful journey, a ghostly bus can be seen traveling the old Route 375. Others claim to have seen three figures in ancient clothing waiting at bus stops in the area, only to vanish when approached. The story of Bus 375 serves as a chilling reminder that not all passengers are who or what they appear to be. It has become a cautionary tale among late-night travelers in China, particularly those who find themselves alone on public transportation in the early hours of the morning. For those who must travel at night, the lessons of Bus 375 remain relevant. Trust your instincts, be wary of unusual passengers, and most importantly, remember that sometimes the biggest danger isn't the journey itself, but who or what you might be sharing it with. To this day, the stretch of road where Madam Lin and Chen Wei left the bus remains a place that local drivers avoid after midnight. Some say they can still hear the sound of a bus engine on quiet nights, even though Route 375 was officially discontinued shortly after the incident. The mystery of what really happened to that bus and its passengers remains unsolved, adding another chapter to China's rich tapestry of supernatural encounters. A reminder that even in our modern world, there are still things that defy rational explanation. The Falls of Echo Valley. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought I was losing my mind. Looking back now, I almost wish I had been. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a travel photographer based in Portland, Oregon. I've spent the last decade capturing the hidden wonders of America's landscape, from the mist-shrouded peaks of the Smokies to the Red Rock Canyons of Utah. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered at Echo Valley Falls. It started with an email from National Geographic. They wanted me to document some of America's lesser-known waterfalls for their Hidden Treasures series. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Spend 3 months traveling to remote waterfalls across the country, capturing their raw beauty and telling their stories. Echo Valley Falls in northern Montana was my final destination. I remember checking into the Pine Creek Lodge, a rustic establishment about 20 miles from the falls. The elderly owner, Martha, grabbed my arm as I was signing the guest registry. "You're not planning to visit the falls, are you?" Her weathered face creased with concern. I nodded, explaining my assignment. Her grip tightened. "There's something wrong with those falls," she whispered. "Ever since that incident with the Henderson family back in '87, some places aren't meant to be photographed." I'd heard similar warnings throughout my career. Every remote location seemed to have its own local legends and superstitions. I smiled politely and assured her I'd be careful. The drive to Echo Valley Falls took me through miles of dense pine forest. The road gradually narrowed until it was barely more than a dirt track, my SUV's tires crunching over fallen pine needles. The GPS signal had long since disappeared, but I had studied the map carefully. The falls were supposed to be just ahead. The first thing that struck me was the silence. Most waterfalls announce themselves from a distance, the thunderous roar of water hitting rock. But Echo Valley Falls was different. The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I grabbed my camera gear and started down the barely visible trail. The late October air was crisp, carrying the scent of decay and approaching winter. As I rounded a bend in the trail, the falls finally came into view, and my breath caught in my throat. They were beautiful, hauntingly so. The water seemed to fall in slow motion, creating an ethereal curtain that stretched nearly 200 feet from top to bottom. The rock face behind the falls was dark, almost black, with strange formations that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. I set up my tripod and started taking test shots. Through my viewfinder, I noticed something odd. The water didn't seem to create any mist or spray where it hit the pool below. It was as if the falls existed in their own pocket of reality, operating under different physical laws. That's when I heard the first whisper. "Stay." I whirled around, nearly knocking over my tripod. The trail behind me was empty. "We've been waiting." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It reminded me of the sound wind makes when it blows through a narrow canyon, except it formed words. I told myself it was just my imagination, the wind playing tricks with the acoustics of the valley. I forced myself to focus on my work, adjusting settings and checking compositions. But as the afternoon wore on, the whispers grew more insistent. "Join us. See what we see." I noticed my hands were shaking as I changed memory cards. The temperature had dropped significantly, and an unnatural fog was beginning to roll in from the base of the falls. Through my camera's LCD screen, I noticed something else. Dark shapes moving behind the curtain of water, like shadows passing behind a frosted window. That's when my camera started showing me things that couldn't possibly be there. In each preview image, the falls looked different. In one shot, the water flowed upward, defying gravity. In another, the rock face behind the falls showed what appeared to be faces, dozens of them, frozen in expressions of terror. I deleted the images, but they kept appearing, each one more disturbing than the last. The fog was getting thicker now, and with it came a compulsion I couldn't explain. An urge to get closer to the falls, to step through that curtain of water and see what lay behind it. My feet started moving of their own accord. Just a little closer. I was about 20 feet from the base of the falls when I heard another voice, this one real, human, and filled with panic. "Stop!" The shout broke whatever spell had taken hold of me. I turned to see a man in a park ranger uniform running toward me, waving his arms frantically. "Get back from there, now!" I stumbled backward, suddenly aware of how close I'd come to the water. The ranger reached me and practically dragged me back to the trail. "I'm Ranger Mike Collins," he said once we were a safe distance away. "And you're lucky I was doing my rounds today." His face was pale, and his hands were shaking as he pulled out a water bottle from his pack and handed it to me. What just happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He looked at the falls, then back at me. "How much do you know about Echo Valley?" "Just that I'm supposed to photograph it for National Geographic." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Did you do any research before coming here? About what happened to the Henderson family? Or the missing hikers in '95 or the photography crew in 2012? I shook my head. "Echo Valley Falls isn't a natural formation," he explained. "The water doesn't come from any known source, and it doesn't feed into any river or stream. It just exists, and it's hungry." Hungry? The word sent a chill down my spine. For lack of a better term, yes, the local Native American tribes called this place the Devouring Waters. They believed it was a gateway to something else, something that fed on human consciousness. They avoided it for generations until European settlers arrived. He pulled out his phone and showed me a series of photographs. They were old, yellowed with age, showing a family of 4 standing near the falls. "The Hendersons," he explained. "They came here for a family photo in 1987. The parents said their children started hearing voices, talking about how beautiful it would be to step through the falls. Both kids disappeared that day. They were never found." I thought about the shapes I'd seen moving behind the water, the faces in the rock. "Since then, we've lost 8 hikers and an entire photography crew. They all reported the same thing before they vanished, whispers compelling them to get closer to the falls. We tried to close the area, but people keep finding their way here. The falls, they call to certain people, creative types especially, artists, photographers, writers." "Why?" My voice was barely a whisper. "The leading theory among those of us who've studied this place? It feeds on imagination, on creative energy. The more creative you are, the stronger its pull." As if in response to his words, the whispers returned, louder now. Show them all." The ranger grabbed my arm. "We need to leave, now. Once it starts calling to you like this, it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." We hurried back up the trail, the whispers following us all the way to our vehicles. Before I left, Ranger Collins made me promise to destroy any photos I'd taken. "They won't show what you think anyway," he said, "but they might show you things that will haunt you for the rest of your life." He was right. When I reviewed the images later that night in my hotel room, they showed impossible things. Faces in the water, bodies suspended in the falls, and in one particularly disturbing shot, what appeared to be a doorway behind the water, leading to somewhere that couldn't exist in our world. I deleted every photo and called National Geographic the next morning to tell them I couldn't complete the assignment. They were understanding, surprisingly so. Later, I found out that I wasn't the first photographer they'd sent to Echo Valley Falls. 3 others had attempted the assignment before me. None of them were ever heard from again. That was 6 months ago. I've since moved away from Portland, trying to put as much distance between myself and Montana as possible. I stopped doing photography work altogether. The mere sight of a camera brings back memories of those whispers, those impossible images. But sometimes late at night, I still hear them. They come in my dreams, showing me visions of what lies behind that curtain of water. They show me the Henderson children, the missing hikers, the photography crew, all of them suspended in a strange, timeless space, their creativity feeding something ancient and hungry. And they're still calling to me. "Come back! Show us what you see!" I wake up from these dreams in a cold sweat, my heart racing, fighting the urge to pack my camera gear and drive back to those falls. Because the most terrifying thing isn't the whispers or the visions. It's how beautiful they make it all seem. How they promise to show me things no photographer has ever captured, secrets no human was meant to see. And sometimes, in my weakest moments, I find myself wondering if it would be worth it. Last week, I received another email from National Geographic. They're doing a follow-up piece on America's most mysterious waterfalls. They asked if I'd be willing to share my experience at Echo Valley Falls. I started typing my response, trying to put into words the horror of what I encountered there. But as I wrote, the words began to change on my screen. The cursor moved on its own, typing out a different message. "Come back to us, Sarah. The falls miss you. We all miss you. There's so much more to see." I slammed my laptop shut and haven't touched it since. Instead, I'm writing this by hand, trying to warn others about what lurks in that remote valley in Montana. Because Echo Valley Falls is still out there, still calling to creative souls, promising to show them wonders beyond imagination. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear water falling upward, and whispers carrying across thousands of miles, telling me that someday I'll return. They're patient, you see. The falls have existed for centuries, perhaps millennia. They can wait. But I know that if I ever go back, if I ever give in to their calls, I'll become just another face in the water, another shadow behind that impossible curtain, another voice in the chorus of whispers that lures others to their doom. So I write this warning. If you ever find yourself in northern Montana and you hear about a beautiful waterfall hidden deep in Echo Valley, turn back. No photograph, no story, no artistic vision is worth what lurks behind those falls. Because in Echo Valley, the water doesn't just fall, it hungers. And once it gets a taste of your imagination, it never lets go. We're still waiting, Sarah. Always waiting. The following was found scratched into the wall of room 237 at the Pine Creek Lodge, dated 3 weeks after Sarah Mitchell checked out. I had to come back. The whispers were right. There are such beautiful things behind the falls. Such impossible, terrible, wonderful things. I understand now why the others never left. How could they when there's so much to see, so much to capture? I'm going to take one last photograph, the perfect shot. The one that will show everyone what really lies behind that curtain of water. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. And if you hear the falls calling to you, if they promise to show you things beyond imagination, run. Run as fast as you can. Because once you see what I've seen, you'll never want to leave, and they'll never let you. The room's occupant, identified as Sarah Mitchell, was never found. Her camera was discovered at the base of Echo Valley Falls, the memory card completely empty except for a single image, a photograph of water flowing upward, and behind it, countless faces pressed against an impossible window, their mouths open in eternal whispers. Among them, some say, is a woman holding a camera, forever capturing the mysteries that lie beyond the falls. Park rangers have since closed off all access to Echo Valley Falls. But locals say that on quiet nights, you can still hear whispers carried on the wind. And if you listen closely, you might catch the sound of a camera shutter clicking somewhere in the darkness, capturing images that were never meant to be seen. The falls continue to fall. The whispers continue to call. And somewhere behind that curtain of water, Sarah Mitchell is still taking photographs of things that exist beyond our world, adding her voice to the eternal chorus that lures others to join her in that impossible space between reality and imagination. And sometimes, on particularly dark nights, hikers in the area report seeing flashes of light from the direction of the falls, as if someone is still trying to capture the perfect shot of whatever lies behind that flowing curtain of water. But those who know better stay far away, because in Echo Valley, every photograph tells a story, and some stories are better left untold. Join us. See what we see. Stay with us forever. The Architect's Inheritance, a Weber family horror. I never should have opened that letter from America, but how could I have known that a simple envelope from Boston would lead me down a path of ancestral horror that would forever change my understanding of family legacy? My name is Heinrich Weber, and until 6 months ago, I was living a perfectly ordinary life in Munich, Germany. I worked as an architectural historian, specializing in preserving historic buildings throughout Bavaria. My expertise in German manor houses and their restoration made me well known in certain academic circles. Perhaps that's why the law firm of Morton and Associates reached out to me specifically. The letter arrived on a cold January morning. Inside was news that would alter the course of my life. I had inherited a property in Massachusetts from a distant relative I'd never known existed. According to the documents, my great-great-grandfather's brother had emigrated to America in 1866 and established a successful business in Boston. The last surviving member of that branch of the family had passed away, leaving no direct heirs. Through some obscure genealogical research, they had traced the lineage back to me. The property in question was a mansion called Weber House, built in the 1870s in a remote area of western Massachusetts. The letter included several photographs that immediately caught my professional interest. The architecture was a fascinating blend of German Baroque and American Gothic Revival styles, something I'd never seen before. As an architectural historian, I couldn't resist the opportunity to study such a unique structure. What I didn't know then was that some buildings are meant to stay abandoned. I arrived in Boston in early February. The law firm's representative, Ms. Sarah Morton, seemed oddly relieved when I agreed to visit the property immediately. "The house has been difficult to maintain," she said carefully. "Several caretakers have refused to stay on the property. We've had trouble keeping it properly preserved." I assumed she was referring to typical maintenance issues with historic properties. I would soon learn how wrong I was. The drive to Weber House took us through increasingly remote countryside. As we left the main highways behind, the landscape became more forbidding. Bare trees clawed at a gray sky, their branches like skeletal fingers. The road wound higher into the Berkshire Mountains, until finally, we turned onto a private drive nearly hidden by overgrown vegetation. And there it was, Weber House. The mansion rose before us like a dark memory given form. 5 stories of weathered stone and timber, its numerous spires and turrets reaching toward the winter sky like grasping hands. The architecture was even more remarkable in person, a grotesque marriage of old-world grandeur and new-world Gothic imagination. But something felt wrong. The proportions seemed slightly off. Angles that should have been straight appeared subtly distorted. It was as if the building had been designed to deliberately unsettle the viewer. "The interior has been maintained as much as possible," Ms. Morton said, her voice tight. "But I should warn you, there have been some unusual occurrences." "What kind of occurrences?" She hesitated. "Perhaps it's better if you see for yourself. Will you be comfortable staying here alone tonight? I can arrange for a hotel if you prefer." I assured her I would be fine. After all, I'd spent countless nights in ancient German castles and manor houses during my restoration work. What could be so different about this one? The interior was a time capsule of 19th century German-American fusion. Heavy wooden furniture carved with familiar Germanic motifs filled rooms decorated with distinctly American Victorian wallpaper and fixtures. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but again, something felt subtly wrong. The carved faces in the wooden panels seemed to follow my movement. The wallpaper patterns, when viewed too long, appeared to shift and change. Ms. Morton gave me a quick tour, pointing out essential features while steadfastly avoiding certain rooms and corridors. She seemed eager to leave before darkness fell. "One last thing," she said at the door. "The locals have some stories about this place. I'd advise staying out of the East Wing entirely, and whatever you hear at night, don't open any doors." Before I could question her further, she was gone, leaving me alone in the growing darkness of Weber House. I spent the remaining daylight hours exploring the ground floor, taking photographs and notes. My professional excitement gradually gave way to an increasing sense of unease. The house seemed to resist documentation. My photos came out blurry or distorted. Measurements of rooms didn't add up. They were larger inside than their exterior dimensions should allow. As night fell, the house began to make itself known. It started with sounds, footsteps in empty corridors, doors opening and closing in distant rooms. I told myself these were normal sounds for an old house. But then I heard the singing. A woman's voice, soft and distant, singing an old German lullaby I remembered from my childhood. The melody drifted down from the upper floors, growing louder and softer as if the singer was moving through the house. Schlaf, Kindlein, schlaf, der Vater hüt die Schaf. I followed the voice, my flashlight beam dancing across dark wood paneling. The singing led me up the main staircase to the second floor, then down a long corridor I hadn't explored earlier. The air grew colder with each step. The voice seemed to be coming from behind a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall. As I approached, the singing stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard something else, the sound of children laughing. I reached for the doorknob, then remembered Ms. Morton's warning about opening doors at night. But my curiosity overwhelmed my caution. I turned the handle. The room beyond was a nursery, frozen in time. Antique toys scattered across the floor, a rocking horse standing motionless in one corner. A large mirror dominated one wall, its surface darkened with age. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped dramatically. My breath fogged in the air. In the mirror's tarnished surface, I caught a movement, a dark shape passing behind me. I spun around. The room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, I saw them, children. 3 of them, dressed in clothing from the 1870s, standing behind me in the mirror's reflection. Their faces were pale, their eyes dark hollows. They smiled at me with too many teeth. I ran. Back in the relative safety of the ground floor study, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Stress, fatigue, an overactive imagination combined with the house's unsettling atmosphere. I poured myself a generous glass of whiskey from my travel flask and began reviewing the property documents Miss Morton had left. The papers revealed a disturbing pattern. Every owner of Weber House since its construction had died under mysterious circumstances or disappeared entirely. The original builder, my great-great-grandfather's brother Wilhelm Weber, had apparently gone mad while overseeing the construction. According to local newspaper accounts, he became obsessed with achieving perfect architectural harmony between worlds. The final entry noted that Wilhelm was found dead in the partially completed East Wing, surrounded by bizarre architectural drawings and rambling notes in German about opening doors between spaces that should remain closed. As I read this, a door slammed somewhere above me. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crossed the ceiling. They were coming from the East Wing. The whiskey glass shattered in my hand. I spent that first night huddled in the study, listening to the house come alive around me. Voices echoed through the corridors, conversations in German and English, children's laughter, crying, screaming. The sounds seemed to move through the walls themselves, as if the house's twisted architecture created acoustic pathways that shouldn't exist. When dawn finally came, I was determined to leave, but as I packed my belongings, I found something that changed everything. Wilhelm Weber's personal journal, hidden behind a loose panel in the study. The journal was written in an archaic German script that took me hours to decipher. What I read made my blood run cold. Wilhelm had not simply built a house. He had attempted to create a bridge between worlds. The unusual angles, the impossible measurements, the distorted proportions, all were deliberately designed to weaken the barriers between our reality and something else. "The children came first," he wrote. "They crossed over so easily, their innocent minds unburdened by the weight of rational thought. But the others followed. So many others. The house hungers for them now. It will never be satisfied." A later entry was more disturbing. "I understand now what must be done. The house requires a Weber to maintain the balance. Our blood built these walls, and our blood must remain to keep the doors from opening too wide. I have ensured that one of our line will always return here. The house will call them home." The final pages were filled with architectural drawings that hurt my eyes to look at. Buildings that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Rooms that folded in on themselves. Corridors that led everywhere and nowhere. I should have left then. Should have burned the house to the ground and never looked back. But I couldn't. The house had already taken hold of me. Over the next weeks, I threw myself into researching the house's history. I learned about the disappearances, dozens of them over the decades. Children were usually the first to vanish in any family that lived here. Then the adults would begin to see things, hear things. Many went mad, others simply disappeared. But most disturbing were the photographs. In every family portrait taken in the house, the same three children appeared in the background. Faint, translucent figures that shouldn't have been there. The same children I had seen in the nursery mirror. I began to understand why the house had called me here. As the last living Weber, I was meant to take Wilhelm's place as guardian of whatever doorway he had created. The house was awakening, hungry for new souls to feed its impossible geometries. Last night, I finally ventured into the East Wing. The architecture there is wrong in ways I can't describe. Staircases that lead to themselves, rooms that exist in multiple places at once, windows that look out onto landscapes that can't exist in this world. And I heard them clearly for the first time, the voices behind the walls. Not just children now, but countless others, calling out in German and English, begging to be set free, or perhaps begging me to join them. I'm writing this account as a warning. By the time you read this, I will have taken my place as guardian of Weber House. The house has shown me what must be done. Wilhelm was right. The doors must be maintained, kept from opening too wide. Our blood built this place, and our blood must contain what lives within its walls. But I've also learned something Wilhelm never knew. The house doesn't just connect to one other world, it connects to many. And some of those worlds are reaching back through. If you're reading this, stay away from Weber House. The property records will show it as abandoned, the Weber line finally extinct. Let it fall into ruin. Let nature reclaim it. But if you hear singing in German late at night, if you see children playing where no children should be, if the angles of your home begin to seem just slightly wrong, run. Run as far as you can, because Weber House was just the first. Wilhelm Weber opened doors that were never meant to be opened, and now those doors are spreading. The architecture of nightmare is reaching out, looking for new spaces to corrupt, new souls to feed its hungry geometries. And somewhere in the twisted corridors of Weber House, I will be waiting, doing what the Weber blood demands, keeping the doors from opening too wide, watching as the house feeds, and wondering if perhaps one day someone will come to take my place as guardian of the spaces between spaces. For now, I hear the children calling. They're always calling now. And the house is hungry again. Schlaf, Kindlein, schlaf. The following note was found pinned to the door of Weber House by local authorities after reports of strange lights and singing coming from the supposedly abandoned property. To whoever finds this, the house has shown me its true purpose. Wilhelm didn't build it to bridge worlds. He built it to contain something trying to break through into ours. The children were never victims. They were the first line of defense. I understand my role now. The Weber blood doesn't maintain the doors. It keeps them closed. But I'm failing. The angles are shifting. The geometry is breaking down. What lives between the walls is getting stronger. If you're reading this, run. Run before you see what I've seen. Run before you understand what I now understand. Run before the doors open completely, because when they do, it won't just be children coming through. Heinrich Weber, guardian of Weber House. May God forgive what we built here. The note was written in both German and English. Local police reported that the house appeared to be empty, though several officers refused to complete the interior inspection, claiming the rooms didn't make sense and that they could hear children singing somewhere in the walls. The case remains open.